first thank all of you in the room and on the web out there in internet land. Thank you for taking time out of your day and choosing our session. I believe Jim and I will, we're very hopeful that we'll bring you great value, and we look forward to discussion, questions, challenges, all those sorts of things that help you grow and take ideas back home, but also it will certainly help us grow and take things back to our respective jobs. So we're here to talk about a really cool story that I feel incredibly fortunate to have a small part in. So let's see if the clicker will work. We'll start there. Oh, okay. All right. There we go. Okay. So agenda is pretty straightforward. We'll do a little bit of introductions. Again, welcome and thank you for being here. Thank you to the MD Expo team for making this possible. And I agree with Megan and echo that. Please take time to thank the suppliers in the exhibit hall. They do make all of this possible for all of us to be able to come here. We are going to hear the story from Jim about what his organization is doing, which I believe is innovative and pushing forward, really pushing the organization to be the very best that they can be and live into their mission. And we will certainly take time throughout the process if we don't want to leave anybody behind on the internet or in the room. So if there's some confusion or immediate questions, let us know. But we definitely want to leave time to have lots of discussion back and forth throughout this. Okay. So most of you know me. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide. You can look at the slide later, read it if you're interested, skip over it if you're not. But I've worked in hospitals, I've worked with GPOs, I've worked in consulting. I have had a very exciting, blessed career to work with a lot of amazing people, some of whom are in this room. So thank you for doing that. What's more interesting is my new friend and colleague here, Jim Daly, who is the CIO at Washington Regional Medical System in Arkansas. I'll let him go into the details, but I want to tell you, he is a CIO and he gets it. All right, it's been such a pleasure and honor to work with him. He has not only responsibility for IT, but he has responsibility for the biomed program, and he'll tell you more about that. But he's also an award winner, so he's good. He's been recognized by HIMSS and others as one of the top CIOs, and so I feel very honored to have the opportunity to work with him and to turn it over to him and let him tell the story.
Wow, well, that kind of introduction, I think we're done here. Right. I'm Jim Daly, and it's a pleasure to be here at MD Expo, and you know, being a CIO, a relatively new CIO, by the way. I began my role in 2020. I feel really privileged to have an opportunity to work with Carol and to meet many of you. But you know, in terms of my background, you know, there's a lot of mumbo jumbo on this slide, but I think what's really important to know about me and my background is I spent virtually all my career on the health plan side of the healthcare equation. So I spent 20 plus years working in consulting for health plans for business optimization, IT strategy. And before coming to Washington Regional, I worked with Healthcare Service Corporation, which is the holding company for 5 large Blue Cross plans. So you're probably wondering, well, how does a guy in health plans end up working at a hospital and being involved in biomed? And, you know, maybe not a super interesting story, but one that's important. So, you know, I'm originally from Arkansas. I moved to Texas when I was consulting to be closer to the airport. And my parents were aging, and I was looking for an opportunity to come back to Arkansas to be closer to them. And I connected with the CIO of Washington Regional, Becky McGee, to help me build my network in Arkansas and find an opportunity. And she said, well, yeah, I'll help you do that. But, you know, I've got a director job open here. And I'm like, okay, well, that sounds kind of cool, but you know, I've been working in health plans my entire career, and you know, I spent, when I was in college, I worked as a transportation orderly in radiology at St. Vincent in Little Rock, Arkansas. But other than that, no hospital experience. So she and I talked for about 3 months before she was able to convince me that I think I might be able to do this. And so, you know, what I was concerned about is really, you know, with my background being on business optimization, is really understanding the inner workings of how a hospital works in terms of the stakeholders and, you know, the customers that include patients as well as providers, and how to pull all that together to really be effective in a director and a leadership role. And, she convinced me to give it a shot. So I did that. So in 2017, I moved to Washington Regional in Fayetteville, Arkansas, and it's been the best move I've ever made. I know you all feel this given the career you've chosen, but I just can't think of a better place where I could add value to my community and really help people. And that's part of something I feel personally, and have an opportunity to do that every day is super important. So in 2020, as we're all going through COVID, Becky, our CIO, had decided to retire. So I stepped into the CIO role in 2020, and you can imagine the turmoil that was happening there. We stood up Arkansas's first drive-through testing center. We went from 0 telemedicine in March of 2020 to doing over 100,000 visits within the first year. And we set up the first drive-through vaccination clinic in Arkansas. So a lot of cool stuff going on to respond to the pandemic. But something that was also kind of cool for me, it was to get exposure to biomed. So the way Washington Regional is structured, the organization is biomed reported into the CIO. And so I walk into the CIO spot in 2020. I'm like, okay, I know IT, I understand our business, but I know nothing about biomed. I know what they do. I know, the scope, but in terms of how to run a biomed shop, I really didn't have much exposure to at all. So that's where being able to rely on folks like Carol, and I was very blessed to be introduced to her, and then listening to our team and internal stakeholders have been very important. So I think we're going to go through some of that as we move through the presentation. So in terms of Washington Regional, Fayetteville, Arkansas, if you're not familiar with Northwest Arkansas, it's a growing area. Some people don't equate Arkansas to growth, but if you think about what's in the northwest corner of the state, you have a little company you might have heard about, Walmart, that's headquartered there. JB Hunt Trucking, Tyson Foods, Simmons Foods, so really national employers that are proud that they do business in Arkansas. But one of the requirements that Walmart has, for example, is that if you do business with Walmart as a vendor, you need to have operations in Arkansas, which is kind of a cool thing to support economic development and that sort of thing. So what you have in Northwest Arkansas is just tons and tons of growth. So if you read the media and Fayetteville typically kind of bubbles up towards the top of the list in terms of growth and a great place to live. I can vouch for that. It's wonderful. There's mountains. If you like fishing, hunting, mountain biking, it's just a wonderful place to live. So, I invite y'all to join us. So with that level of growth in the community, we're a 425 bed hospital, 3,300 employees, 50 plus clinic locations, but we're growing constantly. Our footprint has doubled in the last 10 years, and we imagine we're going to double in the next 5 years, given some of the movement that's happening within healthcare. There is the Walton family. Alice Walton is a leader in our community who's driving some transformation in healthcare through something called the Whole Health Institute. And I encourage you to check that out because it's pretty innovative in what we're trying to do there. We have a lot of out-migration for specialty care, and so we're hoping to make Northwest Arkansas a destination in terms of healthcare. So a lot of great stuff going on in our community. So the problem that I had, besides stepping into a new role during a pandemic and assuming responsibility for something I knew very little about, we were also bringing biomed in-house from a sourced vendor. So in 2017, our CIO and other leaders made a decision to outsource our biomed team. So basically we took our employees and had them work for a vendor that I won't name right now. But I'd be happy to talk about later if anybody has any questions about that. In 2019, made the decision to break from that vendor when our contract came up for renewal. And the wheels were somewhat in motion to begin that offboarding in early 2020, but then COVID hit and just derailed everything. So, when I stepped in the role in July, I had pressure to bring biomed in-house by October, the end of October. And fortunately, because of the decisions we made to not give up ownership of our employees in that outsource arrangement, we had lots of great internal knowledge in terms of how to, do our PMs and the reporting needs and how to run our operations. However, what we didn't have a good line of sight on as we were bringing all that in-house are kind of the strategic decisions that need to be made around clinical engineering equipment acquisition. And so as we were bringing all this stuff in-house, putting in a new CMMS, making sure we've got all the right policies and procedures in place, the right governance. Oh, by the way, our patient monitoring environment is aging and has some immediate end-of-life equipment coming up. And so I'm looking at all this and just thinking, going home at night and going, oh, what do we do? Just really not knowing where to start. And I think, something that's really helped me in my career is not trying to figure out everything on my own and making sure that I'm reaching out and building relationships and asking the experts. And I was fortunate enough to be introduced to Carol. And hopefully I didn't sound too much in a panic when I called you, but I gave her the rundown of everything that's going on and said, how can you help me? And she said, well, first of all, we need to get our arms around this and really look at developing something more strategic. And coming from an IT strategy role, that really resonated with me, and that we really need to look at this as a methodology and ideally look at this in a way that's repeatable. So while our problem right now is patient monitoring, what we really want to do is set the culture in the organization that we have groups of stakeholders that come together and we evaluate these decisions together as a group to make the right strategic decision for the organization. So we had all these issues. So we had clinical needs, end of life I mentioned, fragmented data sources. So we're bringing data in-house, but it wasn't necessarily clean. And so there's spreadsheets, there's a legacy CMMS, there's tribal knowledge, there's all this stuff that we have to pull from. And then besides me, as the leader having the gap in knowledge, some of our team members were, focused as they should day to day on making sure our equipment's safe, well maintained, things that are broken are getting fixed very quickly. So they, didn't really have a good line of sight on, the overall environment. So they were focused in on their area. So we had these gaps in knowledge. So we had to quickly come up with an approach. And what I tried to do after talking with Carol and, hearing her wisdom is try to align our internal stakeholders. So, rather than this being a CIO decision or a biomed decision, really looking across the enterprise, not just in the acute setting, but also in our clinics. Because again, wanting something enterprise level that's repeatable. So anytime we need to make these types of decisions, we can just feed that into our process. So I started with our CNO, and she was very willing to engage and kind of humor me in this process. It wasn't something that we had really done before. Typically somebody said, I need this, go buy it, and it's bought. And so now we've got, 3 or 4 different types of things. And, again, with my IT background and optimization, you all know this, you're experts in this, you want to standardize. And that saves you money in the long run, whether it's training, maintenance, continuity, et cetera. So of course our biomed team front and center here, and we had a few of our BMETs that were very strong in patient monitoring and can add a lot of value to these conversations. And then being an IT guy, I wanted to make sure that, we just didn't have like their infrastructure guy that, made sure things ran on our network okay, but we also wanted to be sure that anything we brought in integrates well with our applications. We want to minimize any manual data entry that may, occur. And so, again, I'll keep coming back to this. While the problem was patient monitoring, we wanted to build something repeatable and create this culture. So engaging all of these areas and cybersecurity being one was very important to me. And also, I've learned a lot here in the last day or so. And when I wear my IT hat, there's always been like this healthy tension between cybersecurity and IT, and I'm learning there's the same kind of healthy tension that I think exists as I've listened to some of the leadership between the biomed community and IT. And I knew some of that going in just based on some of my experience as the director of this organization. And so what I'm trying to do is really drop the walls and, really look at us as one team, and we're all serving the same community. We're all trying to add maximum value, and being able to function well together is important. So having information technology at the table was key. And then strategic sourcing and supply chain management. We have a leader that has been with Washington Regional for about 20 years, and I think has bought just about everything that we've got in the building. And so his knowledge and expertise was just critical, not just from the standpoint of contract negotiations, but just the knowledge. And I think what you'll find, and many of you probably already do this, but when you get out and you look across your stakeholder group and the leaders, there's just tons of knowledge that maybe you didn't realize was there that can really add value to what you're trying to achieve. So Carol, you want to make a comment about external?
Yeah, just a couple of comments for you guys on the external side. I've had the pleasure over the course of my career to sit on both sides of the table, kind of in different lives, right? Back and forth, if you will. And so coming into this as one of the external resources, it was clear to me based on what all of those things Jim just shared with you that I needed to act as an external person, but an extension, right? I needed to be that bridge, which was fortunate because that was really kind of the way I was trained in my internship. Carol, as a clinical engineer, you're the bridge between the business world, the technical world, the clinical world, right? Help those pieces come together. So I really looked at it as being a bridge to the different pieces that I knew this team, this internal team was going to need, and how to help them all relate to these different resources, why they were important and how to get to them. And tactically, so that was sort of the strategic piece, but tactically my job with groups like Philips and Nuvolo is their CMMS. It was like understanding what Nuvolo can and cannot do and could do today versus what Washington Regional would need to put into the future. Philips and Massimo were important business partners for the technology and helping them digging up things like end of life and what are different options available and into manufacturing and service. And some of that data I had and could bring to the table, some of it I had to go find for them. And then knitting that all together, like you mentioned, having the supply chain folks there, they're a member of Vizient, the group purchasing organization. One of my prior lives was working in a GPO. So understanding kind of how those sorts of organizations work. My job was not to give him answers, but to give him guidance, direction, and maybe a bunch of questions. Like, we need to ask this question and get the answer to it, sort of thing. And I think, I guess at this point, I just want to share that with you because I think it's important to think about how you're using your external resources, right? And make sure that we are in a supportive, enabling role and not the driver role. He's in charge, right? Washington Regional is in charge. It's their decisions, but guiding and giving them the here's 3 options sort of thing, right? And here's the pros and cons to each of them. And I think that's important as you do these sort of projects in your own organization, is to have that sight. Back to you, Jim.
Yeah. So, and that, your last point, I think is I'm going to come to it a little later, I think, but it is so important to be able to have a partner that you can trust to give you these options, and you can also feel vulnerable and that be okay. So coming to Carol and saying, look, here's my background, what I don't know, so help educate me, and just beyond the stuff that we contracted to do. I mean, I email her all the time and ask her questions, and she's always willing to provide information. So for somebody that is learning, that is just so important when you create these new relationships with vendor partners, whomever they may be. So in terms of some key tenets that we wanted to put forward, I mentioned our external stakeholders. Making this a repeatable process was primary, and taking the time to explain that to each of the stakeholders is huge. You've got to have alignment across all the leaders in your organization so that as you go forward, you always have that big picture in mind. So starting to explain to them, yeah, I know we've got to address the patient monitoring thing, and we will. We want to build this culture and wrapper within the organization that we can be able to carry forward with any type of clinical engineering need. So that is first and foremost, is make sure you've got big picture alignment. as you bring a resource like Carol in, it's important that that she have access to all of those leaders. And so one of my key roles was making sure that I was facilitating that access and carving out enough time so that she could get insight, ask questions, and the same on, from our stakeholders. They had a lot of questions. They, seek her insight as well. So making sure that you're providing access and adequate time is very important to be successful. And more than 30 minutes. Everybody's busy. Say, okay, yeah, I can talk to her for 30 minutes. Like, no, okay, that's not going to be enough. We might get started with that, but we've got to make sure we're putting the time investment needed here. This is your earlier point. Listen to the experts, and ultimately, I am accountable for the decisions being made at Washington Regional as officer of the company. And it's important that I don't do that in a vacuum. And sometimes egos can get in the way, just to be really honest. I mean, I've had a number of engagements with folks over the years where, I didn't really listen to them. And sometimes that worked out okay. Sometimes you have a vendor partner that, you're seeking to get like a counterpoint from, which is great. But I can tell you, there have been a few times where I hadn't listened and I should have. And so coming into this new capability for me, it was really important that I had someone I can trust, that I would listen to, and that I could take that advice and counsel. So I can't underscore this enough. Please listen. Ultimately, you're the decision maker, but listening and take that under consideration and really making that part of your decision making is very important. And then networking is another thing. So example, this conference. I appreciate getting plugged into this. I appreciate the opportunity to share our story. But beyond that, Carol's helped me make many connections, whether it's cybersecurity, at university programs she's engaged with, some mentor contacts, other vendors. So, you can leverage these relationships to gain access to resources that you may not otherwise have had access to. And I've found your community, or my community, our community, now to be very welcoming and open to sharing tons of information. And I really, really appreciate that. So other things that we kept in mind as we went forward and kind of built this repeatable process is to manage expectations of stakeholders. So of those folks I mentioned, the CNO, the strategic sourcing, the IT people, ideally they want the thing that's going to be perfect for them. And what, I've heard other people, use different terms for this, whether you find a balance across the stakeholders. And how I look at it is harmonization. So, a balance kind of implies that, okay, if you've got 4 people, everybody gets their 25%. Well, maybe everybody doesn't get their 25%, but they can live with where you land. And so it's important to identify those deal breakers for each stakeholder and then manage those expectations as you go forward. So, coming to the end and saying, well, you're not going to get this, you're not going to get that, is a very different conversation than having those checkpoints along the way where you're consistently managing those expectations. And, the IT people want the thing that they're going to be able to plug in a network and not have to worry about maintaining it all. The cyber guys are going to want something with 0 vulnerabilities, which doesn't exist. And then your clinical folks want those things that are most important to the patient. And that really needs to be, front and center. And when you talk about weighting, as you all know, that's very important. And then our strategic sourcing guy just wants the cheapest thing. And, so there's a harmonization that has to occur there, and it's not easy. So managing those expectations and, having some tools that allow you to facilitate that process in a way that is really objective and kind of takes the emotion out of it is very, very important. And issues come up, obstacles, raise themselves on a daily basis. And so as you work through this process with your stakeholders and, when folks have the conversation, well, okay, we're with Philips, so let's just go buy more Philips stuff. That's the easy way out. And maybe that's where you land, but keeping that big picture and the why we're doing this up front and doing that in a consistent way is very important. So when those inevitabilities come up where, folks want to take the easy path, including yourself, it's really important to try to keep that in mind, and making sure everyone has a voice is another thing that I think is is something that we've learned. Making sure that people are heard, they have the opportunity to express their point of view, and they see that their point of view is being considered. Everybody wants, craves to be heard, listened, understood. And as you go through this type of, emotional process, I'd call it, it's important that as a facilitator, a leader, that you're making sure you're bringing all those folks to the table. They have every opportunity to express their point of view. And last but certainly not least, communication is critical. And when you think you're doing enough communication, do more communication. And then when you think you've done more than enough communication, do some more communication. It's never enough. And finding the cadence that works for your organization to keep the why in front of you, to keep the big picture in front of the stakeholders, to keep them informed of what's happening along the way. What you'll typically find is even when you think you're over communicating, someone may think that you're under communicating. So it's not a waste of time to make sure that whether through whatever means is right within the culture of your organization. And for us, it was having weekly checkpoints, just quick stand-ups, 15 minutes, just to report out what's happening, what the progress that we're making, any obstacles that we have. Identifying people that can resolve the blockers is just critically important. I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, I'll take just a moment here. Thanks. Many of you probably heard me talk a lot about this in the past if you were in the room before we talked. So I'm not going to go into the tactical, here's how you do. What I want to share with you is what made this project innovative and pushing, right? Pushing the envelope, so to speak, which is these guys came in open and willing to do all those things that Jim just talked about in terms of inclusivity to the discussion. And so tactically, one of my tactical jobs was to help build this spreadsheet, this tool that would give them visibility to those individual ideas as well as the collective ideas. Now, on this particular one, you can see that we have a clinical score, a financial score, and the technical score. And so my job was to go in each of those categories, spend time with nursing. I gathered data from them. I talked to them. I talked about their environment. I talked about what we, in these guys' particular issue, what was at issue? What was the clinical deficiency? What was not right there in their organization that needed to be addressed? And was it across the board? Was it in a particular area? Did all of that deep dive with the clinicians. And then similarly, financial, that was spending time with the supply chain team who facilitated data and insights from the finance team so that we could build that spreadsheet, right? We could see what is their perspective on this from a data, because as Jim said, it's this whole idea of trying to take a lot of the emotion out of it. You don't take it out completely, but at least a tool like this allows you to set a much less emotional, data-driven foundation, and then you can add as much emotion as you want after that. You can season it, right?
Right.
And so this is what allowed these guys to look at that continue to look at the big picture. They could drill down in any of these areas. But then when they started looking at how does this all roll up, they had a consolidated score. And this, by the way, is not their data, it's dummy data, just to illustrate the point. But it was something that looked, kind of like this, where you would fill in and get this ranking that they could then have those conversations. They could take that time to sit down and say, what does it mean that this, this glob of red right here, are those all the same thing? Or is one imaging, one's lab, and one's in biomed, right? I mean, in their case, it's like, it's on patient monitoring for this case. Was that all in the ICU? Was that in a procedure area? Where was that? What's the impact, right? So then this allowed, this sort of guided some of their conversations, right? But was never intended to say, these are the 5 things you need to replace. It was a guiding tool. And then same sort of thing to really roll it up, because looking at however many lines you guys had, I don't remember now, but it was thousands of line items. That's hard to look at, right? It's hard to draw conclusions from and whatnot. So providing these sort of roll-ups, if you've not used pivot tools. I'm not an expert, but oh my God, those will save your life, right? Because you can change things in that other spreadsheet and then it just goes bing and it's fixed here, right? So get good tactically with some of these tools. You don't have to be the super user, but there's some pieces that are super helpful, because now it was real easy for Jim and team to look at and go, huh, well, only 20% is in the red zone. Oh my goodness, we need to deal with this, right? Okay. Well, emotionally, it felt like we were on fire. All right, maybe we're just smoldering, right?
Right.
Right. And so this gives you sort of some framework to, again, guide the conversation and to focus the conversation and to look, see, this is kind of driving the end of life, if you will, from the technical perspective. And I don't mean just manufacturing and manufacturer service. I'm talking about all those criteria we used to get to the technical score, but it also gives what's sort of the end of life from a clinical perspective, which goes back to those, what's wrong here? What is the clinical deficiency that we're concerned about, right? And the financial end of life. Is this stuff still in the books? Yeah, some of it was. Finance isn't going to let you just kick that to the curb, right? We need to think about how that fits into the prioritization and the scheming and the staging and the phasing and all of that. And so this, again, everybody has their own perspective, but we have the ability to look at them independently and then sort of merge them together in a way that made strategic sense given their framework at Washington. So, Jim, where are you guys now?
Yeah, well, we are, we've taken the tools that Carol's provided for us and have really dug into the details. So, maybe another point, at times in these engagements, you get these tools and you get the data and then they become like shelfware and you don't look at them again. And we haven't done that. We've been able to really extract the value and the insights that data gives us. And so we're kind of at the point where, some of the dimensions that we're looking to achieve strategically, whether it's cost, interoperability, the clinical capabilities, we're going to go out to the market and see what else is out there. As I mentioned, we're a Philips shop, but we aren't afraid of moving away from Philips. So this data and these insights has made our stakeholders realize that, hey, there might be something better out there. So we're doing those demos. We're using this data to develop sequencing plan that's led by our nursing folks. So really understanding, beyond the end of life, that's kind of simple to say, all right, well, we're going to replace our oldest stuff first. Well, that may not be best clinically from a workflow perspective. So our teams are working on developing a sequencing plan, and that's really hard. I mean, we're going to have Q&A, I think, here in a minute, but if any of you have advice or guidance or experience with that, I'd really appreciate it, because that is a big challenge. This stuff is really expensive, as you know, and the way our capital process works at Washington Regional is we have a committee that meets every year that is given kind of a bucket of money to allocate to all the capital needs. And so, as you can imagine, we have hundreds and hundreds of requests that compete against this bucket of dollars. And what we don't want to put ourselves in the situation of is saying, okay, well, we need this amount of money for year 2 or year 3, and then having to go to that capital committee to kind of, arm wrestle or argue emotionally about why this is more important than something else. So what we're doing is we're building a strong business case based on the sequencing plan. We'll build a budget, and then we'll take that to our board. We're a nonprofit, locally governed entity in Washington County in Arkansas, and so we don't have to take this to corporate. We've got a board that's made up of people in the community. We're treating them, their kids, their nieces, nephews, parents, you name it. And so they get what's important in our environment. And so taking this case to the board, asking for strategic capital that can be allocated separate from our typical capital budget will help us, be able to guarantee the funding that we have as we go forward. So that's a really important piece for us. And then, the networking piece I mentioned. So Carol's been able to connect me to a few organizations that have made a transition, and we've had some high-level discussions from different dimensions. So we've talked about the biomed piece, so our biomed teams met with those resources to say, okay, well, what does this mean, for me in terms of making this transition? We've had them talk to our IT people. So what does this mean from a technology point of view? And we're setting up time for the clinical folks to talk with, their peers and organizations. So, I think similar to the stakeholder map that I talked about earlier, when you reach out to these facilities, making sure you're making those connections with the like individuals, because the nursing leaders don't want to listen to an IT guy talk about their needs, what was important to them. It might be interesting, they might want to hear it for a second, but what they really want to hear about is the clinical side and the workflow and those things. So we're taking a pretty disciplined approach. This isn't going as fast as I would like, and I'm telling you yesterday, I'm generally an impatient person. It's something I'm trying to grow with, but you don't want to take this kind of decision making too quickly. Being very thoughtful, being inclusive, engaging the right resources internally and externally, getting that in front of a leadership group like your board, so you have that advocacy. And so you're declaring as an enterprise we're moving in this direction is super important. So I think we're going to land there and open it up to any Q&A.
Anybody on the?
Nothing's showing up on virtual. Does anybody have any questions? Oh, great.
So, you guys are looking at strategic planning.
Oh, wait a second. Let me just have you talk.
Oh, I need the mic.
I'm sorry, I'm dropping on the wall. Keep an eye on the web so we don't leave them behind. Yeah.
Thanks. So you guys are working on strategic planning, and that's really good. One thing that we're finding difficult in our organization is there's well and good strategic planning for 3, 4, 5 years out, things like that. And then you'll get an EOS letter and it's next year. And suddenly your whole budget gets thrown off, which throws off prior projects that were already planned out. What kind of strategies are you looking at as, like, do you plan ahead for that sort of thing? You're just kind of anticipating? Do you have a tool that helps you with that? Or
Our tool is Excel at the moment.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah, with pivot tables, it's great.
Yeah.
One thing that we try to do, and I think, COVID taught us a lot of things, but it especially taught us to be nimble, and that your plans can get blown up really quickly. And so what we try to do, and I don't know that we've figured it out completely, is to try to be agile in our planning. And this is just a key learning opportunity for me. So with technology, you can't look too far out because technology changes so quickly. I'm not sure how that works in the biomed space, so I'd love to get some perspectives on that. We've got monitors and stuff that have been in our environment for, well, maybe I should pick on radiology, not monitors, but, I think we have the machine that's like 20 something years old. And so it works, it serves our patients. But if I've got, a computer that's running on Windows XP or whatever, that's a big problem. And so these are things that I'm learning, and our teams are learning on how do you build into your strategic plan the ability to be nimble and to move around. And it's complex. I don't know that we figured it out.
No, yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Well, I'll add, the nimble and agile piece is so critical important. In the last hour and in some of the recent conversations that I've had with folks, one technique that folks are using is, yes, there's the end of manufacture date, which should set a yellow flag, so to speak, pay attention. And then there's the end of service, and that's the end of service by the manufacturer. You could be tracking a third column, we'll call it end of service 2, which is what is your internal capability? And by internal, I mean whatever your service strategy is, because whether it's you turning the wrench or you have a ISO or, okay, so the OEM said they're going to take themselves out of the game. What is your capability still with yourself and your third party resources? So that might become your end of service too, that would help you anticipate. So when that EOS letter comes out, you don't have to freak. You can say, well, you might have to, because it might already be like, yeah, and our score here is 0 too. But at least you have some sense of where your risk is. So that's a technique.
And I like that.
Wait.
And I like that part of the end of life slide where I wrote in my notes, true end of life seems to be a conglomerate score between everybody. And that resonates with me anyway.
Now, I'll caution you, that's end of life technical. For us as engineers and technicians, that's end of life in our world. Jim raised a good point in his presentation. There was end of life, there were clinical end of life issues. We may have been fine with it. It's still made. I can get parts all day long. But the clinicians are like, this tool doesn't work for me. So we always have to remember there's more than one definition or perspective of end of life. Other questions? Anything online?
Nothing on Herschel.
Okay. All righty. I'll let you do this one, otherwise I'm not going to pour it up.
So I was hoping to take advantage of your role as CIO. There was an article in Washington Journal at the end of last year. It was said, get rid of the IT department. And it's that the fact that IT is no longer a department, it is a tool used by every department, and what that structure looks like. So speak to me a little bit about how you structure your organization, or how you think an ideal structure of an organization that blends IS, HTM. Obviously you still have desktop support, but that's desktop support, and biomed, should be kind of thought about, side to side. And so I'm just, anything you have to say about that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's something that I've thought a lot about in the last couple of years in particular. I think there's some trends to try to push IT out to business units, and that may make sense in some organizations. And I think the rationalization is that putting IT closer to the folks that are doing the work and defining the needs may allow solutions to be delivered to market faster. I tend to think of it a little bit differently. I think it's important that IT is close to the business, but it doesn't have to be, reporting into the business. So I believe pretty strongly in a matrix type organization, where, we may have IT resources reporting into IT leaders, and that's primarily for, coaching, mentoring, growth, training reasons. But then they're reporting and working for different areas of the organization that they're assigned. And so, another way to look at that is, maybe look at your business or your enterprise as portfolios, product portfolios, and then build the organizational structure to enable that. In terms of where biomed kind of sits, I go back and forth on this pretty consistently, and I had the opportunity to sit in the leadership summit, and some really interesting observations there. So, why not roll IT under biomedical or HTM? It's healthcare technology management. And that may make sense in some organizations. That's something I think I've got to think about quite a bit more. But I do think it's important organizationally for biomed to have a strong position in the organization, and that's why they report directly into me as opposed to under IT or facilities or some other department. And so I sit at the executive table and I'm on the board, and so I can strongly represent those needs. So I think regardless where it fits in the organization, the biomed department needs to be able to work at an enterprise level. It needs to have strong partnerships with clinicians, technology, cyber, in facilities. One of the conversations I'm having with one of my techs now is, we're responsible for, warmers and lights and things like that. It's like, well, shouldn't that go to facilities? I don't know. That's an email coming to you at some point. but I know there's perspectives on that, and I think organizationally, in my opinion, doesn't matter so much as the presence and the voice at an enterprise level, so they're represented well.
Yeah, I am struggling with the structuring of interoperability support, as well as cybersecurity reporting matrices. So it's
Yeah. Well, what we're entertaining is we've got a couple of our biomed folks that are interested in networking and cyber, and currently we kind of have this hot potato whenever we have data integration issues between our biomed equipment and applications, and keeping our eye on the cyber ball that just bounces up and down like uncontrollably. And so we're considering getting our biomed resource skilled up to be able to kind of work across the organizations. And again, like organizationally, this might not be very popular. I don't really care who they report to as long as they're doing their job and they're adding value to the organization. And I think the value is directly related to how you position that individual and how you create those partnerships and maintain those partnerships so there's effectiveness there.
Excuse me?
Yeah, I think that last part was so important that I've been around long enough to probably see every model be incredibly successful and fail miserably. And it's about culture, and it's about, at the end of the day, an organization is made up of human beings, right? And we have to keep that, we have to factor that in, that this is about human beings, right? A little history lesson, because again, been around long enough. When biomed, clinical engineering, whatever started, it started in clinical departments. So your comment about, well, should IT be out in the individual departments? Well, that's kind of where our world started. And there are organizations that are still structured that way. They have a separate department that rolls up inside anesthesia or inside the OR or inside radiology or inside the lab, and all are in the same hospital, literally in the same hospital, and they have different reporting structures. And then we have the other end of the spectrum of organizations that have gone to fully centralized, where it's a single report up. I had a role that was sort of headed that direction, regardless of what the zip code was. We were a team, but we were responsible for the enterprise. There are pros and cons to all of these because they're models, right? And I have a saying written on my whiteboard in my office that says every model is wrong, but they're helpful. They guide you. They're not absolute. So it's just understanding what the trade-offs are, right? And talking to a lot of other folks and trying to figure out what went well for them and what didn't go so well, right? So, other questions? Oh, in the back of the room there too. Let's,
We're all good. This. Thanks.
Okay, hello, can you hear me? All right, good. One of the things we did at our hospital that IT did is for all the servers, for all the everything running Windows, all the old stuff that's no longer supported, they went to admin and said, all right, we have the cost of a new one versus the penalty if all that PHI gets out, how much the monetary fine would be. And they sat down and presented, okay, which one do you want to spend? And once they made that aware, they got the ball bouncing and rolling toward getting new stuff and getting all that old stuff out, to where it's to the factor of anything that's old is instantly done away with. If that involves upgrading machinery, it's done, because they don't want that punishment side coming down, which was put in as a financial loss, as an opportunity cost, which it could have been handled the right way and replaced in a timely manner. Is one way that was handled at our facility.
That's great insight. I think that's right on, putting those trade-offs in front of leaders so they can make that decision. And, what we find in our environment is, sometimes, well, we operate as a system. So sometimes it's not as straightforward as replacing that single thing because it's connected to a bunch of other things. And so finding that balance, maybe there's a third option where, okay, we put a firewall in front of it, or we do some other cyber mitigation. Talking about harmonization, our information security people, cybersecurity, don't like that because they want to get all the risks out of our environment. Our legal folks, risk and compliance, may not be a fan of that, but they understand if we rip that thing out, there's clinical ramifications, as well as support ramifications. So your point is an excellent one that I agree with. I think it's important to put all those dimensions in front of the decision makers so that they can, kind of make the decision fairly straightforward and easy. And unfortunately, sometimes it's not strictly a financial, as you all, experienced. Any other
questions in the room?
These are great questions, by the way. I appreciate it. Anyone have experience in transitioning off of one patient monitoring vendor to another? Okay, maybe we can chat later. I can use all the advice you have.
Right. I think we don't have
Well,
any.
thank you all for being here. Thank you to the web. Thank you out there in internet land for joining us. Thank you in the room.